We've been listening to testimony from Daniel Hernandez. He is a friend Jesse Hernandez. He is a friend of the two victims who were shot and killed back in 1993. Prosecutors allege that Daniel Villegas did it. Now, let's just run through the facts of this case one more time if you're just joining us. As I said, this was a shooting, a double murder that happened back in 1993 in El Paso, Texas. Daniel Villegas, 16 years old at the time. During his first trial, there was a hung jury, mistrial. A second trial happened a couple of later. Prosecutors did win a conviction, and Villegas went on to spend 18 years in prison. But after 18 years, he won an appeal, a judge ruling that he had ineffective counsel during that second trial. So here he is at his third trial, now 41 years old, 25 years after this crime happened. And all along, Villegas has said he is innocent. Back in 1993, when this happened, he confessed to the crime, but he and his attorneys allege that this was a forced confession, and in fact, that confession has been thrown out this time around in the third trial. Allison Leotta is a former federal prosecutor. She joins me now via Skype live from Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us, Allison.
Hi, Stacey. Thanks for having me.
So let's just talk about the time lapse here. I mean, this is something we're talking about a lot every day in the news with with what's going on with, of course, the Judge Kavanaugh case. But when you have an incident that happened 25 years ago, and now here we are at the third trial, how difficult is it for prosecutors? I mean, we know that some of the witnesses in this case died. They read previous testimony because those witnesses died. So how difficult is it to dig up evidence of witnesses and have people recall their stories from so long ago?
Right. It's hard to overstate how difficult this is for the prosecution. This is really an uphill battle. Not only have they lost some of their key pieces of evidence, like the confession, like the jail calls that they used in the first two trials, but their people have lost a lot of their memories, the details. We were just listening right now, and Jesse Hernandez said, I can't remember if it was Juan or Bobby who picked up this water meter cover. This is a small point. I don't think it really matters who picked up the water meter cover. But the point is, he doesn't remember who it was. Somebody did. Now, if you asked him the day after, you asked him that afternoon, he'd be able to tell you whether it was Juan or Bobby. So in a prosecution like this, where the government has the burden of proof, of proving beyond a reasonable doubt each and every element of these crimes, the fact that their witnesses are no longer to remember these important details makes it a really steep uphill battle.
Yeah, and I mean, you can't blame the witnesses. I mean, I think the other really interesting thing about this case is that Daniel Villegas has proclaimed his innocence for so long. He was offered a plea deal, right, this third time around, something called an Alford plea. He turned that down, rolling the dice, hoping to get acquitted. For those who don't know, what is an Alford plea exactly?
So an Alford plea is when you say, all right, I'm not going to contest any of this. I agree that it happened, but maybe I was incapacitated. Maybe I don't remember, but I'm not going to disagree with any of your evidence. Let's just call it a day and say I did this. But and maybe he would get time served. Maybe if they'd offered him time served, maybe that would be helpful or enticing to him. But he's still going to be a felon. He's going to have all the difficulty of finding a job that felons have. He won't be able to vote. All of the negative consequences of having a felony conviction would still attach. And so at this point, I mean, he has such a better shot. I can see why he decided to roll the dice. His odds are way better this time.
You think so? Well, I want to hear more on your thoughts about that. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll discuss further. And we're also waiting for that live feed to come back out of El Paso. The courtroom has been on a lunch break for some time now, and we are expecting the trial to resume any moment. Just as soon as it does, we will be bringing it to you live. In the meantime, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back right after this. On Crime, I'm Stacey Delikat. We are talking about the big case happening out of Texas today. That is the state of Texas versus Daniel Villegas. Villegas, now 41 years old, being tried for the third time on murder charges dating back to 1993. His first trial back in 93 ended in a hung jury. He was later convicted in 1995, served 18 years behind bars before getting that conviction overturned. Now he is back in court for third trial. He's 41 years old, as I said. I have Allison Leotta, former federal prosecutor, still with me from Washington, D.C., and right before we went to the break, you said you think it was the right move for him to roll the dice and turn down a plea this time around, even though he likely wouldn't have had more jail time, because this way, you know, he won't have the criminal charges going forward. He'll have a clean background. I mean, his defense attorney said for him this is about clearing his name.
Yes, clearing his name. And honestly, maybe it's about a civil trial as well, because if he wins this, if he's acquitted here, I think the next step for him is suing the state for wrongfully imprisoning him for 18 years. But that, you know, we'll save that for another day. Let's see how he does in the criminal trial. But I think the optics here are so very different. To have a jury looking at a 41-year-old man versus a 16-year-old man, it's just a very different courtroom. The 16-year-old boy, you know, all that edgy energy of a teenager, how the jurors feel in his presence is kind of different than right now. Look at that nice face. You know, he looks like that, you know, nice guy you'd see him at a PTA meeting.
Right. I mean, he's a father. We know, you know, he's married and so on and so forth. You know, we mentioned that the jail phone calls missing, but the confession that he made to police that he says was a coerced confession has also been thrown out this time around. Will that play a big role? I mean, we have to imagine the first two times around that jurors were told he confessed to the crime.
Sure, that's a key piece of evidence, and he knew going into this that wouldn't be played. And not only that, the jurors may have heard news stories saying, well, this was wrongfully obtained. So not only do you not have that piece of evidence, the jurors might be thinking, oh, did the police do something wrong here? Are they trying to frame this guy? What's the story? So it definitely weighs in his favor, and I just wonder how the prosecutors are going to try to build this brick-by-brick wall, that you must have this brick wall beyond a reasonable doubt with these key pieces of evidence missing.
Do you think that in this day and age that we're in the year 2018, when there are so many true crime stories, when we're watching Making of a Murder, all of these stories where a person's guilt is taken into question, and we see in many various cases, you know, very aggressive prosecutors just trying to frame someone for the case, that jurors today think a little bit differently and consider the innocence of a suspect more than they may have back in 1993? I'm just wondering, because I feel like, you know, it's a topic that comes up a lot in popular culture now because of a lot of different TV shows and movies that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Innocence Project alone has totally reshaped how we think about guilty convictions, DNA evidence, and the possibility of innocent defendants going to jail. And your point about Making a Murder is just spot on. This is basically just a mini version, a microcosm of Making a Murder that's taking place in front of these jurors' eyes. And of course, you know, some of them are going to have seen it, and they're going to question whether or not the police pressured this minor, this 16-year-old boy, into making a confession. And then the way we approach it is totally different now.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And you think about, you know, here in New York, the Central Park Five, there's so many examples of cases that the public has learned more about and seen where this has happened. You brought up the civil trial, which I didn't even think about, but assuming he is acquitted, does he definitely have a civil case here?
I think he has a shot at it. Yeah, if he's acquitted this time, it's certainly found not guilty, and he served 18 years in jail for a crime that an appeals court said used evidence that was wrongfully obtained by the police. Well, that sounds like the makings of a civil case to me.
Yeah, I mean, he lost almost half of his life. He's 41 years old. He spent almost half of that behind bars. Well, we are waiting for court to resume in El Paso, Texas. The judge did call a lunch break a little while ago, and we are waiting to find out what the status of this afternoon's testimony is. In the meantime, we're going to shift gears for a moment. Let's go ahead and listen to today's top crime stories.
Here are today's top crime stories trending on Law&Crime.com and across the country. 2 Dunkin' Donuts employees in New York were fired after being caught on camera in a now viral video dumping water on a homeless man sleeping in their store. The unidentified employees can be seen berating the man after the dousing.
How many times I gotta tell you to stop sleeping in here, my nigga? You hear all day, you have enough time, man. How many times are the customers and the people gonna tell you to stop sleeping in here?
It's unclear if the employees will face any charges. A father in Tennessee is now facing child abuse charges in connection with this video of him repeatedly hitting and kicking his 6-year-old son. Randy Dickens of Mount Juliet was caught on surveillance camera beating his 6-year-old son Damien for allegedly misbehaving. The boy's mother, Nia Snow, secretly called authorities to report the abuse. Deputies reviewed surveillance footage and arrested Dickens, who now faces child abuse and neglect charges. Investigators in Maryland are looking for a suspect whose failed bank robbery attempt left him a boneheaded victim of his own crime. The unidentified suspect can be seen on surveillance footage trying to shatter the front window of a store in Prince George County with a rock. Little did this suspect know, the window was made of bulletproof glass, so the rock bounced back at the man and hit him in the head. The suspect eventually recovers after spending a few minutes on the ground, possibly reconsidering his life choices, before fleeing the scene of the crime. One more time in slow motion. God, I love that footage. Remember, kids, crime doesn't pay. The suspect remains at large. Those were today's top crime stories. I'm Anthony Velez for Law&Crime.
Well, I guess in that last story, it didn't really work out the way the suspect had hoped. It's Allison Leotta, former federal prosecutor, still with me. I mean, you see that video, the guy goes to throw the brick or the rock or whatever it is through the bulletproof glass. It bounces back on him, and he's laying on the floor a few seconds. I mean, what do you make of the surveillance video? I mean, police have asked anyone, not just if they recognize the guy, it's kind of hard to see a face, but if they notice someone that may have like a facial injury, to contact police.
I love that video. That's like my favorite crime video I've seen all year. We talk about karma, where, you know, prosecutors are always talking about, oh, the punishment should fit the crime. I kind of wish every crime could happen that way. Like, whatever you there just comes right back at you. I think this should be a PSA, a public service announcement played for all teenagers.
Totally. I mean, and he didn't even get away with anything because he hurt himself, and he couldn't break the glass to get through to the cashier, presumably.
That guy has a terrible headache today and is, I think, going to rethink that again, ever doing that again.
Yeah, well, a good point. They should show that to kids. Stay out of trouble and don't attempt to throw things or hurt people or rob places, because this too could happen to you, and your video could be playing all over the country or perhaps even all over the world. This is kind of like one of those crime bloopers that goes viral. So let's get back to something a little bit more serious now, and that is, of course, the trial out of Chicago against the Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke. Prosecutors, defense attorneys rather, rested their case this morning. I want to get Allison's thought on that in a moment, but first we do want to go back and replay some of what happened during the defense's case. Of course, the key point was when Van Dyke himself took the stand, but that's not all that happened in the defense's case. There was an interesting moment earlier today when the judge got a little upset with some of the attorneys in the courtroom. Let's go ahead and listen. So that was a moment from earlier today when the judge got a little ticked off, it seemed, at defense attorneys. The defense had asked for an offer of proof on a prosecution witness. They didn't write it up, and the judge was really angry. He really wanted that in writing. Allison, are you surprised at all about how the judge reacted, and can we read into that at all in terms of, you know, his feelings towards the defense?
Oh, I don't think you can read into the feelings towards the defense there. I think, you know, what's going on is the defense rested. Somebody else wanted to bring a piece of proof in, and the judge has to make like 1,000 different evidentiary calls throughout the course of a trial. And they're hard. A lot of times they're spur of the moment. Anytime that you can give judge some notice, give them the notice. If you're a prosecutor or a defense attorney, you want some difficult piece of evidence in, write something up, put it on a piece of paper, cite some law. It helps him or her, helps the judge make those decisions. So, you know, that's just a normal sort of back and forth that happens in a trial. Yeah.
It happens. All right, Allison, we are actually, even though we just started talking about Jason Van Dyke, we're going to put it aside again, and we will come back. I want to discuss Van Dyke's testimony and how the defense wrapped up their case, but we do have a live feed now back from El Paso, Texas. The Daniel Villegas case has resumed, so let's go ahead and listen live. So cross-examination continues of David Rangel, Daniel Villegas' cousin. In a nutshell, back in 1993, Villegas told Rangel says that he was responsible for shooting and killing these two men, Armando Lazo and Bobby England. But Rangel later said he believed this to be a joke, that Daniel Villegas often was not truthful, and we just heard him testify that detectives in this case, Detective Marquez, actually made him throw out his first statement because the detective didn't like what he said, and actually had him add or omit certain things into the second statement. So the detective was basically saying, you need to put this in the statement. In fact, Rangel said if Marquez said if I didn't do the things he wanted, he would charge me with the crime. So my guest, Allison Leotta, former federal prosecutor, I mean, what does this do to the prosecutor's case when you hear this witness saying, look, the detective in this case was strong-arming me?
Right. Well, that obviously goes right into what the defense has been all along. The defendant said, I never confessed because the police were so mean to me. That wasn't a true confession. And so now we've got this cousin who's saying, well, I never really meant to confess either because they were also being mean to me. I think the key point here, and what I hope the prosecutor is doing at this very moment, is looking up his testimony, looking up his transcript from the trials back in 1993 and 94. Because what I really want to know is, did he say this back then? Before this was known to be like the key issue in this case, was this his story?
Yeah, well, certainly an interesting point there, as we heard the defense attorney just say, this joke that Daniel Villegas told his cousin, if it was a joke, turned into his worst nightmare the last 25 years of his life, basically dealing with this. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we will have much more live from the El Paso courtroom where this trial number 3 against Daniel Villegas, continues. Stay with us. We'll be right back. David Rangel, Daniel Villegas' cousin, just wrapped up what was a pretty lengthy testimony. He was on the stand since this morning, called as a prosecution witness. Back in 1993, he said that Daniel, his cousin, told them that he had shot these 2 other men, Armando Lazo and Bobby England, though he later said he believed his cousin was just joking about it. Well, now he was talking about how he felt back in 1993 that detectives who questioned him forced him to change parts of his stories, omit certain details, add other details to conform to the narrative that they essentially had in mind. Allison Leotta, former federal prosecutor, still with me via Skype from Washington, D.C. This was a prosecution witness, Allison. But do you think in the end his testimony ended up helping the defense more because he talked about how overzealous the detectives were, how they pressured him to say certain things and basically threatened him with arrest and prosecution himself if he didn't?
This was a very tough witness for the prosecution. This is kind of a classic example of a prosecution witness who they have to call to get in the testimony, but who does not want to cooperate. The defendant is his friend, his family member, his cousin. He was nailed down by these statements that he'd made all this time ago, but he did an incredible job of explaining them away. He thought his cousin was joking. He was pressured by the police to make this statement. And in fact, the police told him, I think the big quote from that testimony was, he told me I would go to prison and be raped.
Right, and be raped. And he says, you know, he was scared. It was one of the scariest experiences, most stressful experiences of his life. I mean, he was 17 at the time when this interrogation happened. He is 42 now. He says at this point, you know, he's tired of reliving it, stressed and emotional, to have to go over it again and again. I do agree with you, though. I think his testimony ultimately ended up strengthening the defense's case, just because for several of the reasons we discussed before. I think that people now were more willing to believe that prosecutors and detectives who were supposed to be the good guys sometimes force people to say things that they don't want to.
I think the jury has certainly been primed for that argument, and that is directly where this defense is going. They're aiming right there.
You know, in this case, and I'm being told that court just took another little recess, so we'll keep an eye on that for when it resumes. Do you think, Allison, and obviously it's soon to know, the trial did just start yesterday, but do you think we might hear from Daniel Villegas himself now 25 years after this crime, after spending 18 years behind bars, still proclaiming his innocence? Do you think that he may take the stand later on in the trial?
That is such a risky thing for a defendant. It's always the most interesting testimony, but it is super, super risky because, you know, there's a lot of evidence against him, and he'll have to confront all the statements that he made, all the evidence, and if he trips up just the tiniest bit, that could be the end of it. So in most of these situations, you actually don't see the defendant testify. It would be surprising to me if he did.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we will, of course, have to wait and see what happens with that. I misspoke before. Court is not on a recess. The jury has been taken out, but there is someone on the stand right now. So let's go ahead and listen live. Welcome back to Law and Crime. Thanks for sticking with us this afternoon. Well, we just saw a little bit of an interesting scene play out in the El Paso courtroom where the Daniel Villegas murder trial, part 3, continues. A witness was called by the prosecution, Fernando Lujan. Now, we didn't get a chance to find out what this witness's relation is to the defendant or to the case or the witnesses because before we heard any testimony, this witness said that he would like to plead the fifth. He asked for an attorney. A little bit of discussion ensued between prosecutors and defense attorneys and the judge called a break. Well, he goes to look for an attorney for Mr. Lujan. My guest is still with us this afternoon, Allison Leotta, former federal prosecutor. You said this is a rather common tactic for witnesses to get up there and change their mind and try to plead the fifth?
It happens pretty frequently. They say, I have a Fifth Amendment, I don't want to talk about this, basically I want out of here. But there may be a real reason here. He got on the stand and said what I said before was actually perjury. I said that Daniel had a gun, but I said that because the police made threats to me too. So now I think I will be committing perjury if I say it again. So they've got to run around and try to find an attorney in the courthouse. I'll tell you, I'm feeling for this prosecutor right now. I know exactly where what she's having to do. Having a trial like this is like herding cats. You are just trying to get all your witnesses in. Everybody's sitting in the waiting room or not sitting in the waiting room. The evidence is there or not there, and then you finally get your guy in the stand, and he's like, "Oh, I plead the fifth," and you just sit back. Your heart sinks. Meanwhile, it's a great development for the defense because here's one more guy who's going to go to exactly that theme we were talking about, Stacey. The police made me stay.
So the judge now has to actually go find an attorney for this witness, and then what will happen?
Right. So they'll find an attorney. The attorney will sit down with Mr. Lujan and say, what's the story? Why do you think you have a Fifth Amendment privilege? Lujan will say that to the attorney. The attorney then goes back to the judge, says, here's why my guy has a Fifth Amendment right. He doesn't have to testify. So the judge will listen to that. He'll listen to what's called a proffer. The defense attorney will proffer why he has a Fifth Amendment privilege. This will all happen outside of the ears of the jury. The prosecutor will make an argument why he doesn't have a Fifth Amendment right, and they'll go from there. In certain cases, the prosecutor could say, okay, I immunize him. I won't prosecute him for anything he says today. But in this case, it sounds like he's about to flip his story in the other direction. So she won't have any motivation to immunize him.
I mean, can she just say, never mind, I'm not going to call him and move on?
She could. I think the better way for her to go here would be to put him on the stand and impeach him. He's going to testify against her. He's flipping. But she can impeach him with his prior sworn statements. She can bring up those statements, ask him if he said it, and then enter. If those statements were made under oath and subject to cross-examination, she can actually enter them as evidence themselves. The jury could consider it as direct evidence of the crime. That being said, man, the optics are just bad at this point for her, and she's between a rock and a hard place right now.
Yeah, for sure. I think, you're right in that this seems to have been a tough day, a tough trial so far in many respects. And we also heard the judge, admonish her and kind of almost talk down to her when he said, I'm not going to humor you. So we'll see how it plays out. Now, quickly, before we go back to some previous testimony, is this all going to play out now, or is this something where they could say, okay, we're going to get Lujan an attorney, let's let him get to his ducks in a row and we'll go to the next witness? How does this, does it depend on a case-by-case basis?
It does, but I would think it'd be very unlikely that it would play out now. Lujan's going to be talking to the attorney in like some witness room or some conference room, and meanwhile, the prosecutor right now, I'm sure, is just scrambling around. Like, is there anyone else she can put on the stand? Well, gets figured out.
Right, right. All right, well, we'll see what happens. In the meantime, we're going to go back to some testimony from another witness. We started to listen to it earlier. This is Jesse Hernandez, who was friends with the victims and who witnessed the shooting. He testified yesterday. For those who may have missed day one of this trial or just need a refresher, let's go ahead and listen to that now. So there we heard the judge saying that Fernando Lujan could invoke his Fifth Amendment right to not testify. Just before the break, when he had taken the stand, he said he did not want to testify. He didn't want to perjure himself because of comments that he made some 25 years ago when this case was first being investigated and tried. Obviously, the prosecutor wanted him to testify, wanted jurors to hear from him, but it looks like it will not go that way in this case. We're now waiting to see who the next witness is to be called. So, Allison Leotta, former federal prosecutor, still with me. You said this is something that's not totally uncommon that we see. Are you surprised? And what do you make of the prosecutor's argument? If we allow one witness to do this, more witnesses will follow.
Yeah, this procedure was very weird. I'm not really sure why the judge did it that way. If I were the judge, I would have been asking that Mr. Lujan, that witness, what's the crime that he's worried about? I'd be asking for a proffer from the defense attorney. What's the crime he's worried about? And usually the prosecutor then can kind of work around that. The fact that he just walked out of that courtroom right now is a highly irregular and is not the way that I would have run that courtroom were I that judge.
Yeah, he just said, all right, you're dismissed, and that was it. And that was so quick at the time that he retained the attorney, the judge did, for the witness. It all unfolded rather quickly. Well, now we see another witness being sworn in. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we will bring you back live into that El Paso courtroom and hear from this next witness as the Daniel Villegas murder retrial continues. Stay with us. So, Allison, my guest, is still with us. Allison Leotta, former federal prosecutor. Going back to this whole little Fifth Amendment dispute that happened, you said you thought it was handled rather non-traditionally. I mean, this is a story where, at least so far, we heard that the defendant's cousin basically, not that he didn't want to testify, but alleging that he had made statements that he was forced to make some 25 years ago. That is what this last witness was insinuating as well. He said things that the detectives pressured him to say. He didn't want to perjure himself. Do you think that we'll have more witnesses who come forward that say they were pressured into saying things by investigators?
Sure, and especially now that the judge has made this ruling, I don't know why a bunch of witnesses wouldn't come forward and say, I want to assert my Fifth Amendment privilege too. Let me walk away also, Judge. And I think we're going to find this case in a weird position because of that.
Interesting. Well, that was certainly what prosecutors are worried about, and the prosecutor said just as much. Let's go back into court now where the witness is on the stand. We're listening to cross-examination of Jose Reveles, a former El Paso, Texas police officer who did respond the night of the shooting in 1993. Rather brief testimony under questioning from the prosecution, and now defense attorneys are talking to him. We're getting ready to wrap up our day here, but remember, this is El Paso, Texas. It's just about 3 o'clock in the afternoon there. Court is going to continue. Before we wrap up, I want to bring my guest on one last time for your final thoughts, Allison, on what we've seen and how we've seen this trial play out so far. I know you're feeling for the prosecutor.
I am. I have to tell you, Stacey, I've been in the position that she is in, this position where she is just trying to make her case to a bunch of witnesses who clearly do not want to be there and do not want the case made. And she is struggling to do that. I was reminded of this case that we had in Washington, D.C., where there was a club shooting. This club just packed with people, partiers, dancing the night away. And a guy pulled out a gun, started shooting up the club. A bunch of people got shot and hurt. Everybody ran. High heels were being thrown everywhere. At the end of the day, can you guess, Stacey, how many witnesses we had to testify about that shooting? 0. That's right. No one saw anything. And this whole scene today just really reminded me of that. But it's even harder because these are the defendant's best friends, his cousins. They really don't want to be there. They're trying every trick in the book to get out of testifying, and
and you know, they seem to feel, you know, we heard, you know, his cousin say, look, he's a little bit angry and emotional about having to relive this once again, yet a third time. You know, I think everyone probably related to the defendant just, of course, wants this to go away. You know, I mean, after 18 years, you know, he wins appeal, he gets out of jail, you think it's over. Well, no, here we go again. And a lot of them, you know, whether they've changed their stories or are saying that the stories they originally told they were forced to tell, there are definitely a lot of issues. You know, overall, how would you say this is going for the prosecution so far?
I don't think it was a good day for the prosecution. I want to buy that poor prosecutor a drink. I'm feeling for her right now. I think she's trying her best, but this was not this was not her day.
Yeah, well, we will obviously be staying tuned here at Law&Crime to see how the rest of the trial plays out. Allison Leotta, former federal prosecutor in Washington, D.C., I want to thank you so much for joining us today and for your very helpful insight as we continue to cover this case.
Thanks, Stacey. Great to talk with you.
Great to speak with you as well. And again, to our viewers, this trial is not over for the day. It's only 3 o'clock in El Paso, Texas. We will carry the live stream on lawandcrime.com just as long as court goes today. So be sure to tune in there. We will be back first thing tomorrow morning with much more on this case. We're also going to have closing arguments in the case of Jason Van Dyke, the Chicago police officer charged with murder. For all of us at Law&Crime, thanks so much for watching today. Have a great evening. We'll see you back here tomorrow morning.